Hello, Biol-50. So today we're going to go over the first chapter. It's basically an introduction to human anatomy and physiology. And there are a few things that we're going to have to definitely have down for the exam, or for the first quiz, I should say, and other things that we're going to talk about in more detail later in the semester. So let's get going. So, anatomy and physiology, what does it mean? Well, basically in anatomy, what you're doing is studying the form of something, all right? You're studying the structure of, in this case, the human, and the relationship of the parts to one another. So basically, anatomists learn a lot about the body through dissection, which you should be doing in your classes. Now, physiology is how the parts work, the functioning of the parts so that the whole organism can survive and basically operate optimally. So physiologists typically use experimentation and the scientific method. So anatomy has a lot to do with taking stuff apart, and physiology has a lot to do with manipulating the systems. So let's look at what levels do anatomists usually study at, and physiologists for that matter. So gross anatomy is looking at the larger structures, things like the stomach, things like the eyeball. Even things that we consider very small are still considered gross anatomy, like the inner ear. That's quite small, but that's still very large compared to microscopic anatomy. These are all going to be very small structures, things that you can see typically with a microscope, all right? So gross anatomy are things that you can see with the eye, easily observable with the eye, all right? Over here in microscopic anatomy, you need a microscope to see things in the fine detail. So these would be things like red blood cells, different types of muscle tissue. In this case, they're identifying smooth muscle, and so on. So, to look at all the different levels or the different parts of the body, we can break things down into super small or super big, and we call those levels of organization, all right? So the smallest unit that can be considered alive is the cellular unit. So the body is constructed of lots and lots of similar cells. Now, they're not all the same, they're similar, okay? And the differences are part of what give you different tissues. So kind of the way I think about it, our cells are like the little tiny Legos, the little tiny square ones, right? The one that only has one little snap on top of them. The tissues are when you put a bunch of Legos together in a couple of layers, okay? So cells, to me, are kind of like Legos. And you have to excuse me, I have a stylus, and it's hard for me to write on my, that's an O, by the way. It's hard for me to write on my screen, so it does look kind of messy, so I apologize. The tissues are going to be stacks of Legos. And one of the things you're going to notice throughout the semester is I'm going to refer to things as like Lego stacks, okay? And whenever I talk about Lego stacks, that's always going to be tissues. And we're going to spend time on tissues, which I know you guys have already talked about. Now, tissues come together to make organs. Organs are formed by two or more tissues, okay? So your heart is an organ, your brain is an organ, and so your stomach is an organ, okay? So here's an example right here, the organ level, the heart. And then we have systems. Systems are when you get many organs together, okay? And then at the end, you have the organism, all right? So the organism is the highest gross anatomical level, and atoms are the smallest microscopic level, but you don't see true life until you are at the cellular level, because atoms aren't alive, molecules aren't alive. Okay, so since we're going to be talking a lot about anatomy, what we're going to do is define something called anatomical position. Anatomical position is basically a set of references or kind of directions that describe the position of things in the body so that you don't have any mix-ups, all right? You know exactly the location that you're talking about. And so anatomical position in a human is standing upright with your hands down to your sides with the palms facing forward, okay? So your palms would be turned out and facing forward. And the body is facing the observer, okay? So for our purposes in this class, you are the observer, and you're looking at the individual who is standing there. And I'm a biologist, not an artist, okay? That's just like a smiley face, sort of. And this individual's arms are kind of hanging down like this, okay? See, I said I wasn't an artist. And the hands are facing forward. Man, I need to take an art class. What do you think? Yikes. Here's a much better picture. I should have just gone forward, right? So in the anatomical direction, we are looking at what we would call the front side of this woman here, okay? Now, the front is going to actually be the anterior, okay? In an animal, anterior is ventral. So we'll talk about that a little more later. Why do we care about dorsal and ventral? Well, that's going to become a big deal when we talk about the nervous system, okay? But we'll talk about it a little bit more later on in this lecture. So anterior is the front. Posterior is the back. So here's anterior and posterior. You're looking at a lateral view here of this man. Superior and inferior. Now, this is something that is kind of, a lot of people get confused about this. Superior is typically anything above the belly button, okay? Inferior is below the belly button. Why do we talk about superior and inferior? Typically, we're referring to blood flow, whether blood has to be pumped up to superior circulation in the brain, or blood can go down to inferior extremities like the feet, all right? So superior and inferior can also be called cranial and caudal. Cranial, which makes sense, right? The cranium, the head, the brain case. And then caudal is another one of those terms like dorsal, ventral. That's a kind of an older term. Caudal basically means farther down along the length of the spine. And again, this is something that in animals, we use very often. So like if you're going to become a veterinary technician, you would use cranial and caudal or rostral and caudal a lot. Dorsal and ventral, definitely. We don't use those as much in humans because we stand upright on 2 feet, and cats and dogs and other pet animals and dairy cows and horses and so forth stand on 4 feet. I'll talk more about that in a little bit. Okay, let's continue on with our anatomical directions. So we've done superior, inferior. Superior is pointing up, inferior is pointing down. Anterior is the front of the body. Posterior is the back of the body, right? Posterior, I mean, think about it. Posterior, the boots, right? Medial and lateral. Medial is always the center, like a center line down the body. Lateral is off to the side, which kind of makes sense. Proximal and distal. This gets confusing. Again, this has to do with kind of the center of things. Distal and proximal you use when you're comparing things. Distal means you have one point and you're comparing, so you have point 1 here, like the elbow, and point 2 here, the hand. The hand is distal to the elbow, okay? So distal means far away. Proximal means closer to. So let's say over here we have number 1, which is the elbow, and number 2, which is the shoulder. The shoulder is proximal to the elbow. Proximal means closer to the middle line, okay? It doesn't necessarily mean that, but it's a reference to it's closer to the midline than the elbow is. So proximal and distal. Distal far away, proximal closer to. Superficial, we don't see that on either of these pictures here, but superficial means shallow, okay? So if you're looking at levels of skin, so let's say you have a stack of Legos here, all right? And this is your skin, all right? And you have blood vessels down here. Deep is going to be your subcutaneous fat, and superficial is going to be the epidermis, okay, or the dermis. I'm just going to put epi down for epidermis for now, okay? So deep would be the fat, and superficial is going to be just the outer skin, the epidermis. And then you have internal and external. That's real, just very plain. External is stuff on the surface of the body, and internal would be organs inside of your body. So if you have any question about the anatomical directions, please feel free to clarify your questions with your teacher or send me an email, all right? Now, things get a little bit more complicated when we have to start looking inside the body, okay? Now, this picture is showing us directions and planes of the body. What we mean is that here are the basic directions: superior, inferior, proximal, distal, and so forth, all right? Anterior, posterior. Sometimes when you need to look at an organ, you have to use like an X-ray or an MRI to cut through the body without, hurting the person, right? And so to do that, we scan through the body in different ways. If you're cutting the body in half, anterior to posterior, we say that this is a frontal section or the frontal plane, all right? You're separating them like a book. Sagittal planes are where you're cutting through the body, but you're cutting straight down the midline. Now, you can do it mid-sagittal, and that's what this means here. Mid-sagittal means going zip right down the midline and probably looking at organs inside the trunk of the body. Or you could do just a sagittal plane off to the side, maybe through the shoulder. Let's say this person has a shoulder injury, okay? So sagittal means that you're cutting kind of through the body at a perpendicular plane. Perpendicular, remember, is this, where one line bisects another line. And then here's your frontal plane that we just talked about. You're slicing something in half like a book. Sagittal planes are easier because you're just zipping through different regions. Like right here, a sagittal plane through the upper trunk would be looking at the heart and the lungs, all right? And then over here, these oblique planes, these are hard to work on because they're done at an angle, and, there would be reasons you do that. Don't worry about it for you guys. But oblique just means you're cutting through the body, usually in a transverse plane, but at an angle. Okay, so here are the definitions for the planes of the body. Sagittal or medial divides the body into the right and left portions. Mid-sagittal divides the body into equal left and right portions. Remember, mid-sagittal right here, so each side is equal. Transverse and horizontal divides the body into superior and inferior portions. So over here, here's your transverse. Transverse and horizontal planes are the same thing, just so you know. This equals this. Why do we have two different terms? The reason why we have two different terms is that transverse typically refers to looking at larger parts of the body. Horizontal usually means that you're looking through a smaller organ. It's just a slightly different vocabulary for people who study the whole organism versus somebody who just studies just an organ, like just the liver alone. And then you have the coronal or frontal. Coronal and frontal mean the same thing, okay? Pretty much. Frontal, again, divides the whole body into anterior and posterior, which right here, right? Here's the anterior half of the person, the posterior half of the person, like a book. Why do we have coronal? I know, you guys, it's so hard when we have these two different terms basically meaning the same thing. Coronal typically is going to mean something smaller. You've cut something in the body in half so that you have the anterior and posterior parts. You open it up like a book, but a coronal section would usually be just one organ. And typically, you see a lot of this in neuroanatomy. Coronal section, cut in the brain. So here's an example of what a transverse section would look like, sectioning through an individual through the thoracic cavity here, which we'll get to in a little bit. And so you can see the lungs, you can see the respiratory pathway terminating in the lungs, you can see the heart, you can see the pleural cavities, you can see a lot of features here. Ribs, the spinal cord, actually, the entire vertebra, and so forth. So this gives you a lot of information about a lot of different systems simultaneously. Now, I promised you body cavities and direction in organisms. We're going to move on to the body cavities, but I wanted to stop and talk about dorsal and ventral again. Now, I'm going to back up for a minute. Remember, we have anterior and posterior in a human, okay? And in this human, she's standing on her feet. So anterior and posterior kind of makes sense. The anterior moves forward in the environment and the posterior comes afterwards. Well, cats and dogs and what we call quadrupedal organisms, things with 4 feet that are down on 4 legs, right? Their anterior and posterior are the same, but because they're down on 4 feet, their belly is facing the ground and their back is facing upward. See, on us, that is not the case. Our belly is going forward through the environment, okay? So that's why we say things a little differently in humans, anterior and posterior. We do have a true dorsal and ventral, so if you want to, and you're at home right now, you can get down on your hands and knees and see that your back, your spinal column would be dorsal, and your belly would be ventral, okay? Why, again, do we do this? Well, that has to do with a lot of anatomy and basic biology and people who studied animals and tried to make sense of their body forms, okay? These organisms, if you were to get a cat and had it stand upright, ventral would still be anterior, dorsal would be posterior. Now, for these guys, this is, this would be rostral, and this would be caudal, the tip of the tail. We don't have tails. That's why our caudal is a little weird, right? We cut off right around here. So we do have rostral and caudal, but instead of being, you know, this appears to be anterior and posterior, it's not. Humans instead have our brain and our spinal cord, and then our neck, right? And our body. Oh boy, this is looking terrible. And then our legs. Teachers, no making fun of Dr. Val, please. I'm sure you're so much better at drawing. I know you are. Here, we'll just make, this looks like a lizard person, doesn't it? Anyways, we still have the same thing. This is still rostral. This is still caudal, even though we don't have a tail. This is not supposed to represent a tail, okay? So anyways, this is what I wanted to show you guys, what the big deal is with, oops, oh, I'm trying to erase this. Oh, okay. We'll just leave that alone. All right, I just wanted to show you real briefly what the deal is with dorsal and ventral. It makes more sense on, say, this cat skeleton than on a human skeleton. Having said that, though, dorsal is always the side with the spinal cord, and ventral is always the belly. Okay, so let's talk about the body cavities. The dorsal cavity, and this is why I bring up dorsal and ventral, this is always going to be called the dorsal body cavity, even though it's posterior on the human. This is still dorsal. The dorsal cavity contains the cranium, the cranial cavity where the brain lives, and the spinal cavity where the spinal cord extends through the rostral caudal axis of the individual, okay? So superior, inferior, or we could call this rostral and caudal. Okay, so this is its own space, the dorsal cavity. The yellow is going to be the ventral cavity. The ventral body cavity is important because it's going to contain the organs of the body. So we have two of these, and I'm going to divide it in half here, okay? You have the thoracic cavity. The thoracic cavity contains the lungs, all right? And the heart and stuff. The thoracic cavity is just the big chamber. Now the pleural cavity is going to separate each individual lung from the heart, all right? We'll look at that in more detail later. And then we have the mediasternum. Mediasternum is just the center part of all of this, all right? So the thoracic cavity is this whole yellow region here. The pleural cavity is going to contain the lungs, and mediasternum is going to contain the heart itself. The thoracic cavity is separated from the abdominal cavity, which is all of this, even this down here, even though there's some dashes here. We'll get to that in a minute. The thoracic cavity is separated from the abdominal cavity via the diaphragm. The diaphragm is a long, big, thick sheet of muscle that helps us breathe, okay? And it's a physical separation of the thoracic cavity and the abdominal cavity. Now, in the abdominal cavity, basically you have your digestive system. Down here in the pelvic cavity, you have parts of the urinary system like the urinary bladder and part of the ureters and reproductive organs. So in males, the reproductive organs pass through the pelvic cavity. Much of the reproductive system in a male is outside of the body. We'll talk about that later when we talk about the reproductive system. But in females, the reproductive system is contained within the pelvic cavity. So we call this whole region here together the abdominopelvic cavity, but where basically our guts are, our digestive system is the abdominal cavity, and the reproductive and part of the urinary is down in pelvic, okay? Now the kidneys are in the abdominal Well, they're in the abdominal cavity, but we'll talk about how they're away from the digestive system in another lecture. So here we are, more details. Mediasternum, the mid portion of the thoracic cavity, contains the heart. The trachea is in there as well. The pleural cavities contain the lungs, and we'll talk about the details of that later. Abdominal cavity contains the stomach, intestines, liver, gallbladder, pancreas, spleen, things involved in digestion. Pelvic cavity, like I mentioned, reproductive organs, urinary bladder. Lowest part of the intestine, I forgot that part, is in there. And then you can break this abdominal pelvic region, okay, the abdominal pelvic cavity, into 9 regions or 4 quadrants. Why do we do that? We'll get to that in a few minutes, okay? So now, we can also divide these into the axial region or the appendicular region. You are going to see axial and appendicular a lot. Axial means center or the head, the trunk, the torso portion of the body. Okay, so all of this part is axial. Okay, appendicular are going to be the arms and the legs, the appendages. Okay, that's how I remembered that. So upper and lower extremities, arms and legs. Okay, now dividing the abdominal pelvic cavity into smaller regions is important, especially when somebody gets sick, because where the person feels pain can give you an idea as to what the problem is. So the simplest way of doing this, and I'm going to start over here on the 4-quadrant division, the upper right, upper left, lower right, and lower left. This is the easiest way to define the abdominal pelvic cavity. The only thing is you don't get as fine a read on what's going on, okay? So let's say somebody says, well, I have pain in my lower right. Now, let's stop for a minute. What we are doing is looking at an individual here in this figure, okay, in anatomical position. So assume that their hands are facing you. Here we are with Val drawing again, okay? So there's one of the hands. The palm is facing you, okay? When we say right, we are referring to the patient's right side. When we say left, we are referring to the patient's left side. Okay, so this is the patient's left. This is the left hand. It's my idea of the left hand, okay? So on the quizzes, one of the things to bear in mind is when we say right and left, you need to be aware that it is not your personal right and left that I am referring to. We are referring to the patient's right and left, okay? So now let's say you have a patient who comes in who has pain in the lower right abdominal pelvic quadrant. Well, that can be broken up into a finer subdivision, okay? To the right iliac, the hypogastric region, the umbilical region, maybe not so much the umbilical, but some of it, and then the right lumbar region, okay? Where's the pain happening? It's really important to know what's going on and what the anatomical directions are, because if somebody does have pain here, it could indicate appendicitis, which is a very dangerous disease, I guess you would say. It's not chronic. It's a very, an appendicitis is dangerous, but having said that, it can be taken care of if the person is treated with antibiotics and possibly surgery. So what you want to do is be able to define where is the pain. So we do need to know what organs are in each one of these individual 9 regions. The right hypochondriatic contains liver. The epigastric contains liver and a little bit of the stomach. And the left hypochondriatic region is mostly stomach, a tiny bit of liver, okay? So basically, up here, the way I memorized it is I did it as a whole brick, the hypochondriatic, with the epigastric in the middle. Epi meaning top and gastric meaning basically stomach. The lumbar is in the middle, the right lumbar, umbilical lumbar, and umbilical for the umbilicus, which is the belly button, okay, and the left lumbar region. And then you have the iliac. The iliac refers to actually the ilium, which are these bones over here, all right, not the iliac crest, which is up here, but the ilium, okay. And the ischium's down here. We don't deal with that. So you have the left and the right, the inguinal region, and the hypogastric. Hypo for lower than, okay, under, and then gastric, meaning basically like digestive system, stomach. All right, so I would recommend knowing all 4 of these: right, left, upper right, upper left, lower right, lower left. That's easy. But memorizing the 9 regions and basically what is within each one for the quiz. And then we come to the axial and appendicular divisions of anatomical direction. This is something that we spend a lot of time in the upper division anatomy class, okay? But I put this in here because, yes, it is important to know. So like cephalic means head, cranial means skull, facial means face, right? Supraclavicular means, above the clavicle, which is right here. These are all important terms. I will give you a list of terms to be able to identify on a quiz, okay? Popliteal, back of the knee, all right? Femoral is the thigh. And femoral has to do with, the femur and so forth. Digital, it has to do with fingers or toes, okay? Phalangeal would be fingertips especially. So these axial and appendicular divisions give you words to describe where, let's say, an injury would be. Like if somebody had a scar in their armpit. I don't know why you'd have one there, but you might, okay? You might have an axillary scar. You might have a scar on the brachial region of your arm, okay? I have a scar, a chickenpox scar, that's adjacent to my umbilicus. TMI maybe, I don't know. It's just chickenpox scar though. So quick check. By the time you're done studying chapter 1, you should be able to name and describe the planes of the body, describe anatomical position, list and describe the body cavities, describe the anatomical quadrants, which is pretty easy: right, left, upper, right, left, lower. The 9 abdominal regions, remember, hypogastric, lumbar, and so forth. Then 4 regions that describe location, and what's the difference between the axial and appendicular divisions. The last thing we're going to talk about is how the body balances functions. So in order for an individual to survive, the body must be operating in what we call homeostasis, basically the happy, healthy, relative, consistent internal environment of the body that allows you to do what you need to do, all right? This allows your genes to be expressed appropriately. This allows you to do all the things you want to do. You feel good when your body is under basic homeostasis. And so homeostasis is always being maintained and restored if something happens to take you out of homeostasis, all right? So let's say, for example, you haven't eaten in a long time and you're hungry and you're not feeling good, you kind of feel dizzy and stuff. You're out of homeostasis, probably because your blood sugar's low, all right? So in order to restore homeostasis, you need to eat something. That is going to involve what's called a negative feedback loop. Negative feedback loops are the things in the body, the metabolic processes, that typically are going to restore homeostasis. Now, sometimes we have what are called positive feedback loops that are used to maintain and restore homeostasis. We'll define those two in just a minute. So let's look at this box here. This box is supposed to represent a whole organism, which looks kind of funny. But let's say the outside is the skin, okay, the integumentary system. This would be the mouth through which nutrients and water and salts get in. You have the digestive system that allows the exchange of nutrients and waste between the digestive system and the circulatory system, the cardiovascular system. Waste can leave and come out through as solid matter in some cases. And then this whole blue area is called interstitial fluid. That's the water that's between all your cells. Water leaks out of your digestive system and fills your body, okay? It fills your cardiovascular system in terms of the plasma component of blood. That's your water in your in your blood system, okay? Salts, sugars, if you have too much sugar in your system, proteins, nitrogen, waste products can enter the urinary system and leave through an exit hole, typically through the urethra. So we release nitrogenous waste here. Nitrogen is a byproduct of protein, by the way. and then unabsorbed organic matter, organic waste, would be leaving through the end of the digestive system at the rectum. Cells, individual cells, will absorb nutrients and water and stuff through the interstitial fluid, and then oxygen and CO2 comes in through the respiratory system. So this idealized, or simplified, I guess you could say, organism has all the systems that the organism needs to survive in the external environment. So feedback loop is the body's general control system. Nerves help give information to the brain, and the brain's going to be comparing information between the external world and the internal world. And one of the greatest examples we have is body temperature, okay? What's going to happen with body temperature is if that the brain notices that there's a difference between the outside and the inside of the body, negative feedback loops are going to kick in to oppose the change in body temperature. So let's say you go outside and it's cold and your body starts cooling down. A negative feedback loop is going to increase your body temperature. Now there are other systems like blood clotting, okay, or childbirth, where positive feedback occurs. This amplifies a change in the body until the change is complete. We'll talk about that later. Let's start with negative feedback. So let's say there's a disturbance, the room temperature decreases, and this is, let's say, at home with a, sorry, my pen battery's going down. Let's say it's cold in your room, you open a window and cold air comes in. It's detected by the thermometer. The thermometer sends information to the thermostat that tells the furnace, hey, increase, flip on so that we can increase the room temperature. And basically, this process will go on. The furnace will continue to run until the normal temperature is reestablished, okay? And then the furnace turns off. Same thing happens with us. You go outside, you're in a cold wind, your body temperature decreases. We have receptors in different parts of our body that detect a drop in body temperature. That sends information to the hypothalamus of the brain, and the brain says, oh, it's getting cold, we better start doing something. And so that causes us to start shivering. Shivering is a way that our body increases body temperature. It makes, it amps up our temp by shivering. The increase in body temperature then is monitored again by the brain until we reach a normal body temperature. So you shiver until you warm up. Once you warm up, you stop shivering. All right, so every time you haven't hit that normal body temperature, you cycle back through. So it's called negative feedback because basically you have a negative change that's occurring and your brain is correcting that. Positive feedback is a little bit different. This happens during birth, childbirth. So what happens is as the baby gets big enough, there's pressure put on the interior of the cervix in the female reproductive system. It's detected by these things called stretch receptors, and that information goes to, again, the hypothalamus and actually the pituitary here. So when the cervix and the uterus is completely stretched, the brain says, oh, time for the baby to come out, and the brain starts secreting, or not the brain, the hypothalamus and the pituitary start making oxytocin. The oxytocin starts the uterine muscle contracting, okay? And as the contractions occur, the baby is moved out of the birth canal. So every time a stretch happens, the brain detects that as, oh, got to push the baby out. Let's make oxytocin. Oxytocin makes the contraction harder, which is detected by the brain, again, as a stretch. You push out and the baby is stretching this region right here, okay, right here. And it's the stretch right here that the brain is detecting in all these regions, okay? This ends when the baby is finally born. So positive feedback intensifies. Every time there's a stretch, more oxytocin, stronger stretch, back and forth until the baby is born. There are lots of normal fluctuations that happen very regularly, and those homeostatically controlled conditions are, you'll notice them throughout the day. They fluctuate near usually an ideal value, and if that's the case, you don't feel too uncomfortable. You're hungry, you go eat, you're fine, right? You're cold, you put on a sweater, you turn up the heat, you're fine. This allows us to maintain balance. These balance values, though, change as we grow via developmental processes or via aging, all right? And we talk about that a little bit later on. So all of our organs work to maintain homeostasis. These functions change as we grow and age and, keep us alive. So by the end of this chapter, you should, in addition to all of the anatomical directions, you should be able to identify why homeostasis is called the balance of body function. What are the feedback loops that we discussed, and how do they work? You should be able to understand that. And how does negative feedback differ from positive feedback? All right? Okay, folks, I will see you in the next lecture.